In the 16th century, Istanbul was the capital of the greatest Islamic empire the world has ever known. Ruled by Süleiman the Magnificent, it stretched from Baghdad to Budapest. The center of power was Topkapi Palace, and then the heart of Topkapi was the Harem. Into it came hundreds of women from all over the empire and beyond, the personal slaves of the Sultan. But in the imperial palace, sex could equal power. This is the story of those women and of the closed and secret world of the Ottoman Harem. In 1520, a newcomer entered the imperial palace in Istanbul. Her name was Alexandra Lizowska. She was the daughter of a priest from the Ukraine, captured by slave hunters to join the army of servants and concubines in the service of the Sultan. There were slaves not of Turkish extraction, or the slaves captured by the Tatar, probably, or from the Caucasus, who were very prized for their looks, white skin, dark hair, and delicate bone structure. And they were predominantly Christian. The enslavement of freeborn Muslims was forbidden by the Quran in our history. Writing about the harem and the Sultan's women, or talking about them, is a sin and is forbidden. So nobody has written anything, and we always have to decorate these stories in our imagination, and foreign travelers have also done this. People went to the Ottoman Empire in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, and they were very taken with the idea that they were all these women locked up together. They soon came up with stories that filled in the gaps of their ignorance about what was going on in the harem. Most of those involved a lot of sex, a lot of rather abusive treatment of young women. The first Englishman to capture a glimpse into the imperial harem was a London mechanic, sent by Queen Elizabeth I to the palace of the great Sultan to install her gift of an organ. Through the grate, I did see 30 of the Grand Signor's concubines that were playing with a ball. The first sight I thought there had been young men, but when I saw the air of their heads hanging down on their backs, it opened no of them to be women, and very pretty ones indeed. They wore breeches so thin I could discern the skin of their thighs through it. I stood so long looking upon them that he would show me began to be very angry, and stamped with his staff to make me give overlooking. The inner part of the palace, especially the harem, was usually called the abode of felicity, because the Sultan had a special relationship with God. This was the reason why all the means of happiness were actually supplied. The best food, the best things to drink, the best music, the best singing, the best manuscripts with figures in them, which is frowned upon by strict Muslims. She has the means to be happy, but it's very difficult to tell whether they actually were happy. A descendant of Süleiman's, one of the last princes to have lived in the harem, considered that his ancestors would have found it more lonely than lavish. The prince lived a luxurious life, but a very lonely life in a way, because they are only eligible hundreds of women around it. I lived amongst them, and I was more or less brought up by them. I didn't realize at the time that it was anything extraordinary because I was used to it. You think everybody else lives that way, but to the priest's daughter, soon to be known as Hürrem, it would have been anything but old women. When the girls first arrived, they would be examined to make sure that they didn't have any physical defects and any diseases. Good. The night of Puchakash, the Gideon, women come to the harem at an early age, and as soon as they arrive, their clothes are changed, and they're taken directly to the harem, the bathhouse. They are cleaned according to our traditions, and taught how to wash before years. The type that Turkish men like is what we call balakitli, flesh firm like a fish, and another detail. They say, either goodbye, meaning the belly should be shaped like a quince. In our literature too, when we describe women, we say cheeks like peaches, lips like cherries, similar like these, and that's what men expect. The Islamic religious law permits bullying. A man could marry up to 4 women at any given time, and could also have concubines on the side. But as the numbers of polygamous marriages were really very few, only the ruling class, for example, like your sultans, would have a harem. When he was a young ruler, it was said by foreign diplomats that Süleiman really lost for frequently visited the palace of the women, and in the phrase "did justice, I made love," and indeed the sultans was encouraged to behave a bit as a price start to cover more and more mass. so that the biological future of the dynasty was secured. I think the reason that the Ottomans chose to reproduce through concubines is to give them more reproductive freedom. The difference between having a child or the concubine and having a child with, say, a royal princess, is that the princess? The married woman has many more rights as a mother. Concubines, because they are slaves, have fewer rights over children. The sultans considered to be above society, separate from it. That was the very ideology of the state. You can imagine that a relationship by marriage to a free Muslim woman, the daughter of some important writer in Istanbul, or some would immediately make the sultans related to a segment of society, and this may cause divisions with other segments, etc. These are the personal slaves of the sultans. They don't have any family. They don't have any connections. We don't know the feelings of the women who enter the harem. There must have been fear and terror as well as other emotions, but also the delight of material comforts, and there was a possibility of becoming the sultan's consort. The imperial harem in 16th century Istanbul was one of the most secret societies in the world. Even in the early 20th century, shortly before it was abolished, it was difficult to discover precisely what went on here. I asked my mother and my mother's sisters about their grandmother's life in the harem, and they said that because it was prohibited to talk about the life in the harem, she could tell nothing to them. Modern historians have been less restricted, and their discoveries have challenged the old Western fantasies. It's not where women lounge around and spend their time, the sort of Orientalist image we have. We should think of the harem as a unique place, as a collection of females who are more highly educated, more highly trained, and trained in a variety of ways than women in this is general society. So I think we might think of the imperial harem as the only female university in the empire. Education, and by education I mean some religious training and knowledge of Islam. She would be taught the etiquette of the court. She would be trained in the skill that most harem women were adapted at, that as embroidery. Wonderful things. The embroidery that she produced could be sold through agents on the market, so it was a profitable skill. It wasn't just a gentlewomanly skill. They learned the palace attitude. That was not very easy. How to greet people, and to walk backwards to leave the sultan's room, and how to be respectful and well behaved at all times, and never be angry. They had lessons every day, and most learned to read and write and to read the Quran. Had the prying eyes of Western travellers pierced the outer walls, they would have perceived a vastly different harem from the sexual paradise or inferno of their imagining. Making love is the one thing most inmates of the harem were not doing, at least if they were following the rules. Relatively few got to spend a night with the sultan. Living there must have been very claustrophobic. If you got a relatively small space with several hundred women living in it, access to the outside world is very limited. The views over Istanbul, if you could get them, must have been quite an effect on people. It was a very comfortable place, that it was more like a comfy prison than a comfy bordello, and the Finn waters were the eunuchs. Only men who had been castrated were allowed into the harem on a regular basis, and like the women, most would spend their entire lives here. The enclosure of women itself seems very objectionable. Perhaps even more objectionable is the mutilation of young men in order to provide eunuchs to staff and protect the harem. It was forbidden by Islamic law to castrate a Muslim or perform the operation among others. Sometimes there's a method called clean-shaven, and which meant that they removed everything, and it made it almost impossible for them to perform their usual body functions. According to an ambassador, they kept silver quills in their turbines, and they would use those quills in order to urinate. One of the duties of the eunuchs was to ensure that the concubines did not have sex with anyone but the sultan. Men were men, or whatever else came to hand. Cucumbers were not let into the harem because they were used as a penis, it is said, but the guards themselves were not beyond suspicion. The process of castration was very frightening and difficult for the boys, and often, out of fear, their testicles would retreat, they would remain intact, and sometimes over time, they would be able to function sexually. There are many accounts of the eunuchs having relationships with the women in the Pulcherie. This was one reason why the eunuchs in the Pulcherie were exclusively African. It was one way of making sure that these men couldn't inseminate the female members of the imperial family without everybody noting that she'd given birth to a half-black child. But for Hürrem, as for most newcomers to the harem, there was little opportunity for dalliance with an eunuchs or anyone. If the girls were higher in the power structure of the harem, they would be given their own quarters. Such as talking in the dark, sharing their bed together, girls' boarding school or comfy prison. It was not perhaps the happiest of the states for the daughter of a priest. But if Hürrem dreamed of improving her lot, there was always the possibility of sex with the Sultan, though this too was hedged with its own barriers of vitriol and restraint. There's some report that, the sultans like to watch lots of pretty girls sort of jumping a bat in the altar together. There's the story that the Sultan would throw a handkerchief towards the woman he called his eye. The surprise of the virgin snatches of this prize and a good fortune with such eagerness that she is registered with joy before she is deflowered by the Sultan. Such reports have never been birthed, and for most harming women not yet.
Numbered among the favourites, a handkerchief was just another item of laundry. Very few of them have ever got to see the Sultan, in that alone, jump into his bed.
We knew him to get anywhere and not just be washing the Sultan's underpads to the rest of your life. You had to maneuver yourself into position with the women who went to bed dead the Sultan. In reality, the Sultan's mother would scout for suitable candidates among these now derelict pools and fountains in the bowels of Topkapi, and physical attraction was far from being her only criteria. An eligible concubine would obviously need to be attractive. She needed to be healthy because her principal job was reproduction. Because of the important role that mothers played in training their sons, she also needed to be shrewd, and the way they were introduced was that they were asked to go to a semi-covered pool underneath the crown princess apartment, and that was an opportunity for the Sultan to watch them and observe them and choose their favourites. Whatever it was that brought her to the attention of the Sultan, or indeed his mother, the preparations for her first with him would have followed a thorough, well-established ritual. The day she is going to be with the Sultan, she goes to the bathhouse and has face and body treatments, and her hands and hair are painted with hair. The idea of any hair on the body was a thought of horror, and so they would remove any kind of hair, including their pubic hair. What they used was really an awful-smelling paste that contained arsenic, and if you left it too long, you could burn the skin very badly. And they used mussel shells to scrape it off. They would put Hannah 4 fingers above the pubic area. It's a decorative, beautiful design detail. Concubines were assumed to be virgins,